One of my most vivid and impactful memories as a child was Passover, the Seder. It wasn't the aroma of the matzo ball soup or the aroma of the gefilte fish. It was, in fact, the story, the epic story of our people's redemption from slavery to freedom. We were made to do hard labor for 400 years. We were beaten. We were whipped. We were humiliated. And a key part of this story is the we. The Haggadah reads, B'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo ke'ilu yatsa mitzrayim. We are commanded to tell the story not just as if our ancestors were slaves, but as if we too suffered those terrible ordeals. Why? Why is this our origin story as a people? And what does it say about what it means to be a Jew? The Romans believed that they were descendants of the gods. Native American communities believe they descend from majestic animals, and other nations descend from kings. But Jews, our people, come from the lowest of the low, from slaves, so that we will never forget what it is like to be oppressed, to be the other. And so that in every generation, when people are oppressed, there will be Jews who stand up and say, this is not right. As Reformed Jews, this story of Tikkun Olam, of our responsibility to repair the world and to stand up for the oppressed, has become the central story that we taught our children about what it means to be a Jew. This story was all the more salient growing up here in Memphis. In this city of civil rights struggle, I was proud to come from a faith tradition that called on us to work for a better future for all peoples. I was proud to come from a faith community, from this community, led by Rabbis Wax and Danziger and Greenstein, and members like Herschel Feibelman, Jack Goldsmith, Myra Dreifus, Abe Plow, Mel Grinspan, Marvin Ratner, Jossie Wurzburg, and so many others who fought for the rights and the welfare of our African American neighbors, who internalized Passover's lesson and helped bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. So what happens when it is not the other, but it is our own people, the Jewish people, who are oppressed, discriminated against, made to feel the other? What happens when 1,200 Jews are murdered in their homes or at a music festival with brutality that the Vikings or even ISIS would be ashamed of? What happens when 250 people, most of them Jews, are taken hostage? 101 still languishing today in the tunnels beneath Gaza. What happens when immediately following October 7th, members of our country's leading institutions, our most prestigious universities, not only fail to condemn Hamas's pogrom, but say the Jews deserved it? What happens when hundreds of thousands of people in our country and millions around the world march chanting from the river to the sea, or Intifada revolution? Not content with the violence of October 7th, they call for the elimination of the Jewish state and for half the world's Jews who live there to go back to Poland or to be pushed into the sea. But of course, it's not only Jews in Israel who are under threat. Our country's most prestigious universities allowed for Jew-free zones on campus. Anti-Semitic incidents skyrocketed in the past year, with over 10,000 reported to the ADL since last October 7th. In the words of FBI Director Christopher Wray, the Jewish community is uniquely targeted by pretty much every terrorist organization across the spectrum. And when you look at a group that makes up 2.4% of the American population, it should be jarring to everyone that the same population accounts for 60% of all religious-based hate crimes. Close quote. If we as Jews teach our children to stand up for all people when they are oppressed, surely we should teach them to stand up for our own people when we are. After all, in the famous dictum of Rabbi Hillel from Pirkei Avot, Im ein ani li mili, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If we don't stand up for ourselves, who will? The responsibility to prioritize care for our own people is not a new idea. The 1,800-year-old Midrashic text, the Mechilta, teaches, if an Israelite and a Gentile stand before you in need, you ought to prioritize the Israelite. If a member of your family and a citizen of your city stand before you, you ought to prioritize your family. If the poor of your city and the poor of another city stand before you, you ought to prioritize the poor of your city. End quote. If, God forbid, your child breaks his arm, and at the same moment in Timbuktu, another child breaks her arm, who are you more concerned with? If your daughter graduates from law school and the same day a new lawyer passes the bar in Brazil, who are you more proud of? In the words of Rabbi David Wolpe, to love your own family is not a prejudice, but a virtue. It is the recognition that the people who are closest to you should be closest to you. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is not a violation of human nature. That is the way of human nature. Right now, our Jewish family is under threat. A year into this terrible war, the IDF is still surrounded by enemies on 7 fronts. As rockets and drones continue to rain down, Israeli society is living a nightmare that will not end. Over 100,000 residents from both the south and the north cannot return to their homes, and the hostages are still captive over a year in. And the Israeli army is stretched thin, with many reservists away from their families and their businesses for over 200 days so far, leaving behind spouses, grandparents, and children to manage the best they can while their husband, wife, or parent is off at war. And yet, thank God, we have a Jewish army. Because im ein ani li mili, if we are not for ourselves, who will be for us? Yet, of course, with the Jewish army, we as Jews have to demand that the IDF live up to its Jewish values, valuing life and minimizing civilian casualties. And on this count, despite the misleading talking points we hear too often, the Israeli Defense Forces has done a remarkable job. The United States' foremost expert on urban warfare, West Point professor John Spencer, has concluded, quote, Israel has done more to prevent civilian casualties in war than any military in history, above and beyond what international law requires, and more than the U.S. did in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, setting a standard that will be hard for other countries to repeat, close quote. The IDF has an entire unit dedicated to minimizing civilian casualties. They make phone calls, send text messages, drop leaflets, giving up the crucial element of surprise, putting Israeli soldiers at even more risk, all in an effort to save Palestinian lives. And yet, as grateful as I am that Israel has an army, that for the first time in 2,000 years, instead of being at the mercy of the local monarch or the angry mob, as grateful as I am that Jews can defend themselves, I have to admit that during this war, like the Pharaoh from the Passover story, I have too often hardened my heart to the suffering of the Palestinian people. Israel's war is just and necessary to protect Israeli civilians from an enemy determined to perpetrate October 7th style attacks until there are no Jews left. not only in Israel, but around the world. And yet, this just war has still taken a devastating human toll. When I see the despair and the cries of a Gazan mother who has lost her child, too often I think in the rational part of my mind, it is tragic. But Hamas intentionally hides underneath her, using her and her child as human shields. In those moments, chazakti et libi, I've hardened my heart. And I've done it too often. But then sometimes, when I hold Shoshi in my arms at night and sing her the Shema, our hearts almost touching, I can't help but weep, not just for the Israeli families, but also for the Gazan ones, whose children now sleep in the dust. As Jews, we are taught not to celebrate the suffering of our foes, but to mourn with them. As Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove teaches, according to the Passover Seder, not just Jews and not just non-Jews, but even our enemies themselves should be the object of our concern. As we recite each plague, we dip our finger into the cup and remove a drop of wine so as not to partake in its sweetness. The reason? Even though the Egyptians enslaved us, and even though the plagues were necessary for our redemption, we as Jews are still saddened at the suffering the plagues inflicted on the Egyptians. Rabbi Hillel says, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" But he doesn't end there. He adds in the same verse, "Ukshani la'atzmi ma'ani." If I am only for myself, what am I? We must be able to stand up for ourselves. And yet we cannot be so single-minded towards our own people that we neglect the rest of the world. As I learned from our colleague, Rabbi Jonathan Jaffe, the 1,800-year-old text, Mishnah Gittin, teaches one sustains poor Gentiles along with poor Jews, and one visits sick Gentiles along with sick Jews, and one buries dead Gentiles along with dead Jews. All this is done on account of the ways of peace, to foster peaceful relations between Jews and non-Jews. In the words of Rabbi Shai Held, family first must not devolve into family only. But it is precisely by caring for our own people that we make the case to care for every human being. When Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and Billy Kyles and Cleophas Smith and our very own Rabbi Wax marched here in Memphis, they marched for the dignity of African Americans, and we would not say that is wrong or self-centered, because by demonstrating for the dignity of one group, for their group, they showed that the dignity of each and every person matters. In the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the universality of moral concern is not something we learn by being universal, but by being particular. Because we know what it is to be a parent, loving our children, and not children in general, we understand what it is for someone else, somewhere else, to be a parent. There is no road to human solidarity that does not begin with moral particularity. By standing up for and loving our own people, we demonstrate the dignity that should be afforded to every person, not just to Jews. And if we don't, who is going to stand up for us? Im ein ani li mili. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Passover's lesson of tikkun olam, of repairing other people's brokenness, cannot be the entire story of what it means to be a Jew. So what is the story we will write for our children this year? We must teach them to stand up and to speak out against those who want to destroy us or who want to marginalize us because of who we are. but there must be even more to our story. Once again, in the words of Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, to reduce my Jewish identity to fighting anti-Semitism is a victory I refuse to grant my foe. It was great to be a Jew on October 6th, and it's still great to be a Jew today. When standing up for Judaism means only standing up to anti-Semitism, we are leaving out the best parts of our story. The best parts of our story, like the invention of Shabbat, a time to put away our technology and our work and give thanks for the blessings and the people in our lives. Like Kehillah, like community, which we are so blessed with here at Temple. A community to raise our children and our grandchildren in, to celebrate with in times of joy, and to stand next to in times of pain and loss. And like our ancient wisdom tradition, the Torah, which gives meaning to our days and connects us to every generation of Jews who has come before us and who will be here long after we are gone. At the community vigil for October 7th on Monday nights, Memphian Adi Brown told the story of her cousin, Agam Berger, who turned 20 years old in Gaza this August and who remains captive over a year into the war. They learned from other hostages who were kept with her, who have since been released, that even in captivity, Agam tries her best to keep up her Jewish practice, lighting candles on Shabbat when she can get them. And even though her captors force her to cook and clean every day, she refuses to work or cook on Shabbat, no matter the punishment that may follow. Her cousin Adi asked all of us at the vigil, if Agam can keep up those mitzvot as a hostage, what new mitzvah, what new Jewish practice can we take on this year? To stand in solidarity with Agam and to say that our Judaism matters. And so I ask you, how will you stand up for Judaism this year? Will you write Shabbat, Torah, or community into your Jewish story? There is one final part to Hillel's statement. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? When it comes to rewriting our Jewish story, if not now, when? Shabbat Shalom and Gamar Chatima Tova. May the year ahead be a better year for our people, and may we all be sealed in the book of life.